In the project, I'm looking at individual experiences of gendered violence during the Rwanda genocide of 1994. And I'm using oral history interviews, which were conducted by the Visual History Archives between 2011 and 2017. And I'm hoping to sort of work on this next year with the Hammond Center and transform that into like a website. But yeah, the project is really focusing on this idea of the model of disclosure that we have, which sort of associates disclosing as agency. And I'm sort of challenging this by highlighting the role of silence and considering silence as a form of agency. So I'm adopting also a sort of individualized approach towards these stories, the survivors' stories. First, sort of to highlight the importance of seeing the woman, seeing the individual story and the individual experience within this overall mass scale picture of the genocide, so that we can sort of understand gendered harms like sexual violence as a violation of against an individual before being, this genocidal discourse of violation against the Tutsis. And this is something you see a lot in the media, for instance, the perpetual articulations of how many women and girls were raped during the genocide, and human rights reports, really focusing on the numbers and the horror of the genocide. But sort of what I noticed is that it precluded discussions of individual narratives of rape, such as rape or other gendered harms, in sort of function to de-individualize narratives. Women's sort of ordeals become voices of a collective, voices of collective testimony, collective trauma. So that's the first sort of aim. And then the second one that I have with the project is sort of draw attention to this question of silence again, to the heterogeneity of responses to silence and disclosure in the aftermath of the genocide. Women had very different journeys. And my main question is why so few women reported, because 500,000 were abused within 100 days in 1994. So why so few reported the assaults? Why do we associate agency with disclosing, agency with freedom, emancipation, all these kind of things? And what I found out in the interviews is that women had many reasons to stay silent. So the first one being, there is a lack of sort of an effective legal framework to address the sexual violence during the genocide, which was mostly centered on looting, killing, things like that. So that meant that victims had little to gain, financially speaking, from making their experience public. The second thing also, women prefer to stay silent because they were fighting for justice for the deaths of their husband and the children, for instance, and that was sort of their priority. Another reason that I saw in the interviews, there was no, and that was a really interesting one, there was no proper vocabulary in Kinyarwanda to address the acts that were committed against them. So there were no words to describe I was raped, for instance. So they used a lot of colloquial expressions such as he took me as his wife, he took turns on me, things like that. He did that bad thing to me, which again sort of hindered disclosure of sexual violence because it's really hard to describe it. And finally, and one of the main one was obviously the trauma, the guilt, the shame associated with sexual violence and HIV, which sort of reduced the victims' willingness to disclose transparently to their community in 1994, but also to the male interviewers 20 years later for the VHA, because the interviewers were men, most of them. So the sources and the voices that I chose, the collection was assembled in 2013. And out of 86 audiovisual testimonies, I chose 12 women, aged between 41 years old at the time of the genocide to 14 years old. So I have a really broad age spectrum in the data set. And each interview was conducted in Kinyarwanda, so I'm I used the help of a translator to, translate the videos. And so I guess I'll just share a bit of some quotes that I encountered so you get a better sense of what I'm talking about. So one of the women, Walida, for instance, her name is Walida, she explains why she stayed silent. So I was never open to anybody again. All the people are the same for me now. We talk superficially and never tried to talk about it at LCAH, which was the local court. Had nothing to say about it. I can't talk about it. Who can I talk to? So except to the doctor who treated her wounds, she only spoke about her rape experiences for the first time in 2011 for the DHA. And sort of her initial willingness to speak out was met with hostility from her friends, from the broader community. So that was her decision, resulted in her decision to remain silent for the decades to come. But she also chose silence as a survival strategy. A lot of them, it was a safety net. Silence was a safety net, and that was empowering to them. Talking and speaking out wasn't, because of hostility and more reprisal and all. So for instance, she was urged to join Rwanda Women, which is a local survivors association, but she refused. So she sort of shielded herself from others as a survival strategy. So for instance, she says, I used to go there and sit. Some women came and shared the testimonies, how they were beaten and lost people, but did not touch me at all. I did not care about it. Sometimes I spend 2 years without joining those women, Jeanne and others. I just disappear, and when they call me, I change my telephone number. So again, withdrawing from sort of social interactions associated with the genocide and adopting this form of social isolation was her way of coping, was her way to build strength again, inner strength again. And a lot of them did this. A lot of them explain why they didn't want to be vocal about it. Another reason was, which I mentioned earlier, was the court. So a lot of them, sort of their concerns and complaints after the genocide were not always centered on sexual violence. In the interviews, they articulate sort of their pain, frustration, and sorrow with the lack of legal reparation for the murders, for their extreme state of poverty and destitution, and they emphasize sort of their wish to have public recognition, financial aid for these things, but they don't indicate that the focus for reparation should be on rape. So at LCAH, which is the local court that was implemented after the genocide, most of them sort of reported the death of family members. They accused the rapist of murder, but they did not reveal the actual rapes. So Concessa is another woman, and she explains how she used the court as a place where she could talk openly about who killed her husband and children, how her house was destroyed, stolen, but did not talk about the rapes. So she explains, I was jobless, living in an unfinished house. I had a lot of orphans in my care. There were 15 of us at home, me and my child, and another 13 orphans. I could not even afford to buy shoes. So like many survivors trapped in poverty after the genocide, the options were so limited and efficient that their main goal was sort of, to obtain reparations based on their socioeconomic background, like how to get out of this misery. But of course, they didn't report the rapes to court because there was no real framework for sexual offenses established after the genocide. Sort of rape was always considered within, made secondary to other crimes, and also considered within this broader crime of policy of cleansing, this broader crime against the Tutsis, not as an individual, not as a violation of an individual. So a lot of them obviously were dissuaded from seeking assistance, let alone report the rapes. So that's another reason. And then another thing that I wanted to share was their euphemistic terminologies that they use in their interviews. So to disclose in their ways what happened to them. And what I noticed is that it was sometimes the only sort of available option for them to describe their experience, and that occurred sort of outside the sort of the parameters of what they understand of sexuality and consent, sexual life is thought. For instance, Brigitte and Amina, two women who were 14 and 16 years old at the time, have a lot of difficulties to verbally describe the assaults because their experience as a teenager did not fit sort of in the Rwandan cultural model of sexuality. So for instance, Brigitte was adopted from a health center. She was forcibly married during the genocide. And in talking about the man who raped her, she shows a lot of confusion about the comprehension of the assault. So she says, for instance, I suffered most from having sex with the man without having knowledge about sexual relations. That is what I hated the most. And she uses broad stroke to tell her story for the first time in the interview. And a lot of them do that. For instance, Brigitte's narrative, the men came back and we spent the night in the store fighting, and they decided to take me out and kill me and throw me in the pit where rubbish was thrown. While going there, I remembered what had happened there and I shouted calling Therese. Then the two men brought me back. After that night, I stayed with Therese and Margarita for some time, and those two men brought me in that old building where others were killed. That building was closed, they were inside it. Those men wanted to take me to another room, which is not where others were, but I shouted calling for Prisa and no one responded to me. So they brought me back where Therese was, and I still stayed there until 3 p.m. When I reached there, I lied on the mat at distance in order not to be recognized, that I was very cold and be discovered. I was so trembling that everyone noticed it. Therese came to pick me up and took me out. So that's what I meant by, using all these different broad generalizations, broad stroke to disclose in their own ways. And I could go on and on. There's just these fascinating interviews, but I'm going to stop there for now. And I'm hoping next year to sort of, maybe create a website of some kind around this public history project. Thank you.